plenty of our own news here, John. Cut day comes and goes, no waiver claims. They do make a relatively, for this time of year, high-profile addition in wide receiver Noah Brown. I think he helps them. I think he competes for playing time. What do you make of the Brown signing?
A couple things. So I think he fits that identity that they're looking for when you want guys who compete, who play tough and all that. I think he can help you in multiple ways. One, special teams. Two, as a receiver. If nothing else, he's a good blocker. And then we've seen him have some really good games in Houston last year. And then, he had a good final year at Dallas. So I think he's shown that he can be a contributor in that as well. So I think if he's not doing a whole lot from scrimmage, he can still help you. And he's a good blocker. So I think he fits the mindset of the kind of guys they want. The question for him is only going to be one thing. Can he stay healthy? That's been the biggest issue for him over the last couple of years, and it's why he's no longer in Houston. But if he does stay healthy, they have somebody who's definitely going to help. And I think, I think there are a lot of guys in that group who you say, this guy can do this guy can do that. So they have guys that can do things, but they don't have that strong number two guy that you say, like, what you're going to get here. So this just puts another guy in the mix that can do something for them.
Does it put more pressure on Cliff to be able to get the best out of the guys that can do that thing, or one thing here, one thing there? Because if you don't have a legitimate number two, you need to have multiple guys that can be experienced in other different things.
Sure. And I think to be honest, where I think it's going to go is almost that number two target's probably Zach Ertz. So I think there's a way to spread it around without relying on the receivers, but we also know, they're going to use some three receiver sets. But yes, I do think it's on Cliff and then Anthony Lynn and Brian Johnson, those guys to maximize what else they have at, especially for Johnson and Cliff and Bobby Ingram at the receiver position, finding out okay, this package is great for Zacchaeus. This one is great for Luke McCaffrey. They do different things. So yeah, I think there's going to be something to that, but the other part is you don't want to become predictable with that either. Like a couple of years ago, you'd see Cam Sims and De'Ami Brown come into games like, well, here comes a bunch of runs. You don't want it something like that. So they're going to have to do some other things that can help, or other packages, whatever. But yeah, I do think it's incumbent on them. But I also will go back to Zach Ertz. I think he's had a really good camp, and I think he can be that number two target for you in addition to McLaurin.
Dude, I think Ertz absolutely is that guy. I think Eckler's going to have a big role too, but yeah, Ertz has been fantastic. I think you saw a roster decision based on supporting Zach Ertz, frankly, in keeping Colson Yankoff, because Ertz isn't going to play a single snap of special teams for you. Right. And when you're in very clear jumbo hardcore running sets, I don't think he's a big option there. Like I think they really want to manage him so that he can stay on the field. I mean, 17 games. I asked him, individual goals. He said, play 17 games. Do you agree that maybe that's why Yankoff stuck around, at least in addition to the work he put in?
Possibly, I think, but I do think they talked about how much they liked their depth there before. And yeah, I mean, I think if you're going to get rid of Cole Turner, which is now in the practice squad, but then you want that other guy, you're right, to play special teams. And he's a bigger guy who can run a little bit. So those guys are always valuable on those units. And he did a lot of kick coverage, and then punt coverage as well, or punt protection, punt coverage, whatever. So, yeah, I think he can definitely help you there. And I do think you're right. Like, you want to keep Ertz on that field. And maybe he's told you the same thing too. Like, he did not feel he had to go on IR last year. He didn't feel he was that hurt. I think the Cardinals just did that. But there are going to be questions about the durability when you hit that age. They just always are. And if they can do that, I think he can be very productive. And I think he clearly feels that way. But in watching him this summer, it's like I don't know how you can come away thinking anything but, because he looked that good. Now we'll see what it looks like against other teams, but even in the joint practices seem to do pretty well too.
It's going to be fascinating. We also saw, John, the trade of John Ridgeway yesterday. That's a guy that has been a contributor here, has given them some meaningful and some good snaps. What do you make of that decision to kind of roll with Phil Mathis?
I thought Mathis started to do some things the last couple of weeks that maybe we haven't seen enough of lately.
Sure, ever.
And it seemed like, because early in camp, Ridgeway was working ahead of him. And I didn't think you'd keep two of those guys. Like typically in Dan Quinn's defense, you're not getting a lot of the beefy fellas in the middle, right? And you're going to want the Newton types who can penetrate, get to the quarterback, right? So I didn't think they'd keep both. And Mathis maybe offered a little bit more penetration, and maybe Ridgeway had more value too on the open market because there were several teams interested in him. And so I think that's part of it as well. But I thought he did a nice job in that last preseason game, especially. But so did Mathis. So, to me, it felt like it was pretty close. And if it's pretty close, you're going to get rid of the guy who has maybe a little bit more value on the market.
John, you've been covering this team for a long time, and you've seen all types of things. You've seen people approach. What's different in this approach compared to things you've seen prior?
Approached by the organization or by whom?
I'm talking about the front office because all the front offices prior, they baffled me.
Well, I think that's exactly it. I think the difference to me is there's an organized structure and an organized power structure, and where it's coming from. There's the owner is the owner, right? And he's got a clear role, and he's not sitting there meddling and telling them to go trade for this guy or that guy. And but you have the GM who's got his setup, and then clearly Quinn is the coach. I think to me that it's the setup is just different, and it's more conducive to a normal organization to me. And there again, I think there was a blurring of lines, even though it was a coach-centric thing the last several years. I also thought there were times where it was kind of a blurred vision, blurred responsibilities. And in the past, it would be Bruce Allen dipping his toes where he shouldn't, and so I think that to me is the best thing that they've done this offseason is they've clarified the structure of the organization, and it feels like there's just more. I mean, this is the phrase that we heard at the initial press conference was aligned vision, but I do think there is that. And so I think that to me is the dramatic difference from, we all can tell stories of guys they've signed in the past where the coach is like, we don't want this guy. And then Bruce and Dan are like, well, too bad, here he is. And the coach, what are we doing with him? I mean, there were multiple guys like that. Like, and one of the things that they said yesterday that was almost the reverse of what has happened here in the past was, especially mostly in the previous 20 years before the last four, but because I felt like they did, they wasn't quite as much like this last 4 years. They didn't win. They didn't draft well. There were other issues, but it was the not collecting talent, trying to build a team. That's what they're doing now. Before, I always felt like they, for Dan Snyder, most of his reign, it was about collecting talent, not really knowing how to build a team.
I totally agree with that. And Peter said that specifically is that, we're focused on building a team. I think of the last 4 years, they drafted poorly. They evaluated poorly. Dan was also pretty non-existent, especially after he got like his double seeker probation from the league. Like he was fairly removed. And once this joint was on the market, he was all the way removed and nobody was spending a dollar. You know what I mean?
Right. There were a lot of issues that popped up. And there were times he'd still kind of make his presence felt, in some big quarterback trades perhaps. But yes, by and large, it was better. And that's where it goes back to the setup where like now, like Adam Peters has a scouting staff. They are in charge of this. The coaches provide their input over here. And you're going to take things into consideration. Before it just felt like, it just didn't feel like there was the strongest direction and who should be making what decision. And I think now it's different.
So let's talk about the team they've built, because I do think the Dotson trade, kind of the Ridgeway trade, there's been some decision-making that to me is clearly focused on big picture, long term, and not necessarily going into week one. And in a lot of ways, I think there was so much excitement. And Jaden is an exciting young player, generates a lot of excitement. But I feel like maybe there's been a little bit of a reminder to fans hey, these guys went 4-13 last year, and while we're going to improve and compete and try to kick ass, this still could be a little lean.
Yeah, for sure. And I think if they had taken, for example, when the new group in Jacksonville took over a few years ago, they kind of went crazy on the free agent market. I remember talking to people at the time, and they're like, they didn't like that approach because it kind of felt like when you're really ready to ascend in year 3, a lot of those guys are going to be either, you're on their way out, or you wouldn't have as much capital to. Yeah, and so I think that I think this is clearly an approach that is more with an eye toward long-term building more than it is like a quick fix, because this does not look like a quick fix. Now, can they go out and play well? Yeah, because I think there's a lot of things we just don't know about what is the impact of the defensive staff and there's just the scheme, the play calling. What is the impact of the play calling on the quarterback, the offensive line, et cetera? So I think there's a lot of things we don't know yet. And how good is Jaden Daniels going to be and when? So those are all questions that if you answer them in the affirmative, well, you can be better than maybe people expect. But I do think you're right. Like this is always, I think the vision here has always been on the long term, which is why you saw guys come in like Eckler, Ertz, and Wagner on 1-year deals and trying to lay that, again, they've talked about creating identity and all that. So I think that's a big thing for them. And then if you win in addition to that, that's good. But I think they know, like, it's like we know what the roster looks like. This was not an overnight fix. So, I mean, there's still a little ways to go here.
Totally, man. And I think it's a good reminder. I do think it's cool to have high expectations for Jaden and be excited about Jaden.
Yeah, for sure.
You know what I mean? But I think Houston last year was the outlier. That's not the norm. Yeah. You know what I mean? And I think we're all well served to remind ourselves that.
These guys don't have the pass rushers that Houston did, right? And there are certain other guys they hit on in the draft. Tank Dell comes out of nowhere too, and C.J. Stroud has a really, really, really good rookie year. So I think like all those, and then the division is different. So all those things come into play, and not to make excuses, like it may just be that Houston's roster was in a better spot, and then D'Amico Ryans did a hell of a job, right? And so I think that there are a lot of things that go into that. But listen, if Jaden Daniels goes out and plays pretty well, but we look at them and say, well, they got this solved. I think people are going to be pretty happy going to the offseason if you have that position, not just solved, but like he looks really good, because you haven't had that in a long time. I think if I'm a fan, I'd rather see that than they kind of stumble along and win 7 games. But I'd rather see I think you'd rather see them win a lot of games than have Jaden Daniels be the answer. But I think for this year, if you can create that sort of identity they want and play a way you want, and then have the quarterback position like it's good, then that's.
Don't you think that opens up, like you get a quarterback and everyone is behind him, and it seems like he's the guy. Free agents are willing to come to something like that.
1,000%.
I think it opens up that whole aspect for the offseason.
I think hell with Noah Brown. That's a dude that had options. Not that he's like, if Jamar Chase hits free agency, I'm not trying to make a ridiculous comparison, but Brown had options.
Yeah. I don't think he's Jamar Chase though, JP.
Fair point.
But what I'm saying is when you start building,
I agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah, we sit here and we talk. When you start building something, you have to have something to offer people to make them want to choose your place over another place. And right now they're starting to work on the facilities. And then if you get a quarterback on top of it, man, please. This thing is real quick.
I agree with you. And then like there are little things too that I think people, they clearly in the league look at this organization far differently than they did more than a year ago. And it is such different hands. And then if you get that quarterback, then you're going to want receivers like to go where there's a good quarterback because it helps them get paid. And
dude,
Peters instability.
Peters wouldn't have even taken an interview with this organization until the sale.
Yeah.
No. Hell no.
Right.
Hell no. So I agree with that wholeheartedly. I was thinking that when you started saying it, BMitch, that like you get that solved, And then and if you hit on some of the other young guys, whether it's Coleman or Sinnott or Samerstill, McCaffrey, if those guys start to look good too, then I think it for a fan, it's like, okay, they hit the draft and now these free agents are going to want to come here. And now maybe you can finally build a sustainable winner. And I think in the past, I never really thought that was possible. It just wasn't set up. It was never conducive for long-term success ever.
Johnny, last thing. Obviously, the Commanders kick off next weekend, but it's college football kicking off this weekend. Have you watched this Connor Stallions documentary yet?
I have not, and I don't think I will. I've heard snippets and I've read stuff. I think there's a lot of contradictions that he offers. I think it's amazing that a guy who has this great memory for signs and can do all that can't remember if he was at a game a couple months earlier. So I just think for that school, Connor Stallions ain't walking through that door this year. That's my thought.
Dude, the passion between Ohio State and Michigan is so significant.
Yeah.
But dude, real quick, obviously the Buckeyes are supposed to be loaded. They kick off Saturday against Akron. I imagine they're going to throw 70 on them. You need that quarterback to be good. He's got to prove that. Transfer from K-State. But I trust your eye and evaluation. Can you just tell the world that may not know yet about this freshman wideout that's supposed to be better than all of these Ohio State wideouts?
Jeremiah Smith. I mean, he's already going to start, and that's rare for a freshman. They're loaded at that position. This guy's coming to start already. Like, they're already talking about, like, this could be the best one of the group. And, like, we're talking, like, the Garrett Wilsons, the Olaves. I mean, Marvin Harrison Jr. and some of those guys saying, like, this guy could be better. So, yeah, I mean, I think that could be a very, very special group again. And
you got to prove it to us, John. You got to prove it.
1,000%. But like, this is what they're saying going in. So we'll see how it plays out. But going in, that's what they're saying. And so,
is he a true freshman? Like, is this an 18-year-old kid?
He might be 17 starting school. You never
know. He's going to be really good. So yeah, and this is the guy that they've been kind of waiting for him to get on campus and get going. So I think, listen, they should be really good. They should be really good every year. And I just think they put, like, the way they've approached this off season, that you kind of have to win. So, you got to win.
John, thank you for the time as always. Everybody check him out. ESPN.com for all his written content and the John Keim Report.
Got BMitch on tomorrow. Fun talk.
Oh, how about that? All right. Thank you, Johnny. We got a boogie.
Thanks, guys.